Okay, so this is the mammoth slideshow for Baroque and Rococo art, layered in with a whole bunch of other stuff about the 17th and the 18th century. Baroque art, in particular, is the art of the 17th century. It's the art of the Counter-Reformation, the art of the Scientific Revolution, and of Absolutism. So when we say Baroque is connected to these great movements of the 17th century, what do we mean? Well, for the Counter-Reformation, what we're talking about is the reaction to the Reformation, to Luther, to Calvin, and all those other guys. So there's 100 years of religious turmoil, and you remember that in the beginning, the Catholic Church is sort of demoralized. It's back on its heels. Maybe we really are that bad, but remember, the church rebounds. And so the Counter-Reformation, once it gets going, is really a time of optimism. The 17th century Counter-Reformation is the sense that the Catholic Church has its mojo back. Rome has retained its independence in the face of the new monarchs. It survived the rise of Protestantism. And so we see the church filled with power, confidence, and faith, and that's what Baroque art means in a religious sense. It reflects sort of heavenly and earthly rule within the power of the church, the secular and the sacred. So we see Baroque churches being designed, and they're designed in Rome, where they fulfill the needs of this resurgent church that's got its mojo back, and this sense of kind of pushing back on the Renaissance. The classical world is being subordinated to Christianity again. This, all of this Greek stuff. We're gonna get rid of that. I mean, or at least we're gonna subordinate that. We're gonna go back to biblical themes in our churches. In Vienna. Also a time of great optimism, because you remember that the Turks had been defeated at the Siege of Vienna, and then were being rolled back. And the Habsburgs really felt that they had saved Christian Europe. Well, perhaps they had overestimated their importance just a little bit, but they had accomplished something important, and they were feeling good about themselves. And so the churches and the art of this time reflect that. Okay, that may be straightforward enough, but what about the Scientific Revolution? Where is Baroque art in the Scientific Revolution? Well, here you have to remember that the Scientific Revolution creates a time of spiritual crisis. This realization that the world is not the center of the universe, and Europe is not the center of the world. And so Baroque art, with its confidence and its drama, are going to offer images to bolster the shaken faith of people who are concerned in sort of the way that we saw in the Enlightenment Salon, how easily it was to be shaken from this. Finally, in terms of the other big cultural themes, absolutism. It also embraces and is embraced by the Baroque. The absolutists use art to show their authority, right? They show that they are the heirs to the Roman Empire, that they are divinely sanctioned, that they require the absolute obedience of their subjects. Interestingly, absolutist Baroque art does not really focus upon religion. When you go to Versailles, for example, you don't see as much religious art as you might expect, because, of course, the art is focusing not on the religious themes, but on the political themes. The monarch, in particular, portrayed over and over again, either directly or allegorically, as masterful. For this reason, mythology is important, whereas in religious Baroque art you get much less mythology, much more biblical imagery. It's sort of flipped in the absolute context, where the classic allusions to Greek themes are used to support the monarch's power. All right, so we talked generally about three divisions of the Baroque period, just to sort of give you a sense of the arc. The early Baroque, which begins about 1590, we're talking heavy Reformation, Counter-Reformation here into 1625, or early 30 Years' War. The early Baroque is very religious, it's papal patronage in Rome, using this consciously to support the Counter-Reformation. It moves from the somewhat extreme, languid quality of mannerism into much more decisive, dramatic stuff. And here we'll see people like Caravaggio, who we're going to spend some time on. Bernini, of course, who you've seen with my beloved St. Teresa, and Maderno. This period moves on then to the High Baroque, which is sort of the middle of the 17th century. This is exuberant. This is when Baroque really gets going. And we see more of Bernini, Bergamini, St. Van Dyck, Rembrandt, the great Rembrandt, Rubens, who we'll be looking at, Velazquez. This is, when you think Baroque, the true masters of Baroque. This is sort of that high period in the middle of the 17th century. And then finally, late Baroque, which is what's going to take us through the 17th and into the 18th century, where the center really moves from Italy to France. It's also popular in sort of northern and central Europe, with places like Germany and Austria. Sort of the same way we saw the Renaissance ideas and themes moving from the Mediterranean parts of Europe up into northern and western Europe, with the sort of the northern Renaissance art and how it was incorporated that stuff but then changed. We're going to see a similar kind of movement for the Baroque, and people like Tiepolo and Newman are the archetypes of that. Okay, so when we say Baroque art, what are we talking about? Well, there's this idea of an emphasized unity in the arts, that painting, sculpture, architecture should all be united in their common purpose, and that we're talking about new spatial relationships, whereas your Renaissance classical was focused on the sort of lines and linear relationships, mathematics. Baroque is very different. It is a clearly defined program. This is something that where even the great artists were often beholden to their patrons in a way that was not so true in the Renaissance. So the artistic freedom diminished. However, the art itself is all about movement and passion and this tension between naturalism, classicism, between illusion and reality, between light and dark. You'll see all of these sorts of things in the pictures we're going to look at. And of course, the great, if you're going to think one thing when you think Baroque art, you think about Louis XIV, the Sun King, you think about Versailles. So what does Baroque painting look like? Well, again, it's about color, not line. And it's about chiaroscuro, which is an Italian word. We went over this when we looked at the Renaissance. It's about this sort of use of bright lights and dark shadows and finding the interactions between them in very sophisticated ways. How do you make something look bright when it's just a two-dimensional blob of paint? You also see compositions that were wavy and circular and broken lines, as opposed to the clean linearity of a lot of Renaissance art. And we're going to see is that it merges imperceptibly, gradually, and then is finally sort of replaced by Rococo, which is the great movement that comes next. Okay, so who are the great painters of of the Baroque period? Well, I mean, there are many, and we'll look at a lot of these people. Caravaggio, Delatour, Gentileschi, Poussin. These are some of the names that we're going to look at. So let's start with maybe the most dramatic, the most fun. Michelangelo, Caravaggio. Call him Caravaggio. Don't get confused with Michelangelo. There's only one Michelangelo, but Caravaggio is not a bad sequel. Caravaggio lives during the sort of from 1572 to 1610. Over that transitional period, and he's really one of the great formative influences on Baroque. People look at him and really say, I want to do that, or at least something like that. He is just the absolute bad boy of this period. He's constantly drunk. He's getting in brawls repeatedly. He's bullying people. He's getting in fights. At one point, the Pope issues a death warrant on him. He runs out of town. But he's so brilliantly talented that he's able to just sort of keep on going and producing this amazing stuff. And his lifetime, he was very popular. He was a rock star. When he dies, actually interesting, he's sort of forgotten. Maybe because he was such an unpopular person. And we don't sort of come back to recognize him until really the 20th century, when he becomes very, very famous again. You'll find people saying, like, Caravaggio begins modern painting. I mean, everything before him is maybe the Renaissance or but modern painting, as we understand it, begins with Caravaggio, maybe. So what does that mean? Well, take a look at this. This is the supper at Emmaus. It is. You may remember the story when Jesus is resurrected. He comes back and he actually eats with two of his disciples, and so this is a painting of that moment. I mean, imagine your closest friend, your teacher, your mentor is killed, and then he comes back. It's kind of a big deal. And this is that moment where he comes back and he sits down to eat with you. So I mean, notice the shadows are dark. There's presence here. There's a kind of a fluidity to this, and so you sort of see this suggestion, these early elements of Baroque. Here's another one. This is a very controversial painting. This is called The Death of the Virgin. So the dead woman here on the right is the Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, and there is it's not described in the Bible, but there was a Christian teaching, a tradition that when Mary died, the 12 apostles who were scattered all over the world doing apostle things were sort of miraculously returned and were present when she dies. And there was a great controversy over whether did she actually die, or did she rise up to heaven without ever actually dying because she's so special and holy that she couldn't actually die. So here is here's Mary, and you can see that in this painting she's dead. She's definitively, absolutely dead. And so that was a controversial thing. Also, somewhat controversial is that Caravaggio probably modeled the Virgin on his mistress, who was a prostitute, which you can imagine also got people sort of upset. But in terms of the painting look, I mean, if you stare at those apostles, I mean, that's grief. It's not the grief of someone tearing out their hair or screaming. It's quiet, alone, forsakenness, that this presence is gone from us. Moving on to another religious. This is the Crucifixion of St. Peter. Peter was crucified in Rome, and he famously, again, this is not in the Bible, but the story is that he wanted to be, so there would be no thought that he was equal to Jesus. He wanted to be crucified upside down. And the Romans, ever commenting, said, fine, we'll crucify upside down, whatever you want, pal. And so again, the Baroque, right? Bright colors, dark shadows, drama. And check out Peter. I mean, Peter is ripped. This is a muscular apostle, right? Like a muscular church. Remember, this is the art of the Counter-Reformation. This is a strong, virile presence in art. Here's another one. This is the conversion of St. Paul. You may know the story. Paul was a Jew who was in charge of persecuting Christians, but he's on the road to Damascus, and God speaks to him. Paul, why do you persecute me? And Paul is struck momentarily blind by the presence. And again, look at the drama, look at the color. A guy being struck blind by the presence of God. One more, another religious Caravaggio, right? The Saint Francis of Assisi in ecstasy. A famous story where Saint Francis was visited by an angel, and this, like so much Caravaggio, there's sort of multiple layers here. I mean, it's a genuinely spiritual painting. This is a nighttime landscape. But there are these, notice the strange glimmering flickers in the background on the horizon, the light on the angel and St. Francis. Where is that coming from? Who cares? It's about the drama and the moment. It's really quite beautiful and quite serene. There was also gossip about who was the boy who posed for the angel. Was he Caravaggio's boyfriend? Caravaggio has been sort of almost romanticized by certain scholars as a sort of a patron of homosexual expressiveness. The evidence is probably that Caravaggio had relations with men and women at different times in his life, and it's not clear how much any of that affected his art more than anything else. But if you look at the sort of the sensitivity that these figures are created with, and the sort of the intimacy of this moment, it's really quite wonderful. Much less serene, much less gentle, but wow, what an impact is this. This is Judith beheading Holofernes. This is an Old Testament story. You've really got to know your Bible to know this one. Judith was a hero of Israel. There's the book of Judith, and she gets this Assyrian general who's oppressing the Jews. She gets him drunk. And then she takes his sword and she decapitates him, right? Approaching to his bed, she took hold of the hair of his head and said, "Strengthen me, O God of Israel, this day." And she smote twice upon his neck with all her might, and she took away his head from him. Judith, chapter 13, verse 7, 8. I mean, that's some pretty serious Old Testament righteousness, and this painting is all about that. I mean, trust Caravaggio, right? Picking the moment of absolute maximum drama with blood spurting everywhere. I mean, lots of people like to do this scene. It's, I mean, you know, if you're an artist, what a great thing to paint, right? But Caravaggio, of course, you know, does it best. Again, pure Caravaggio. The model for Judith was a Roman, a famous Roman courtesan that he used many times, and he probably got the sort of the look on Holofernes' face and the blood and all that. He spent time hanging around at public executions, looking and staring. How do these things look? How do these things work? And then he captured it here in this incredibly dramatic, gruesome painting, which is biblical, but is also very much more. And of course, Baroque, right? I mean, rich colors, bright lights, dark darks, drama. This is, you know, this is a painting with something going on. Not biblical, but quite wonderful in a very different way. This is called The Fortune Teller. And you have to look closely to really get the story of this one. Here what we have is this foppish young boy, and he's having his palm read by a gypsy girl, and, you know, he's sort of flirting with her, and she's looking him in the eye, and he's very pleased with himself, and this is all sort of, oh, you know, it's a moment, you know, between this rich guy and this common girl, and, you know, love or something. You have to look closely, but if you look at the fingers on her hand where she's holding his wrist and his palm, one of her fingers is gently sliding the ring off his finger and ripping him off. Yeah, there's a certain subtle commentary here on the vapid nature of aristocracy. Here's another one, a similar vein. I mean, just check out the range on Caravaggio. This is called the card sharps, and again we see this idea of rich boys in over their heads getting in trouble. The guy playing cards on his left is rich, but very unworldly, unsophisticated, playing cards, staring down at his hand. The boy on the right, about the same age, but notice he's got cards hidden in his belt behind. The older man, sort of in the middle, is working with the card sharp, the cheat. He's looking over the mark's shoulder. He's signaling to his companion, "What's the kid holding? What do you need to pull out?" And you know, these paintings were they're funny. The detail is exquisite, and you know, there's also a poignancy to this. I mean, you can just look at it and laugh and say, oh, well, you know, here's a rich boy in over his head getting ripped off and he deserves it. But, you know, there's a depth here too, right? I mean, the kid who is doing the cheating is no older than the kid who's being ripped off. And, you know, he's going down a pretty bad path. And the older guy who's dependent on the younger guy is the cheater. And there's this kind of brutal, low-life realism that you will get ripped off, but also this luminous kind of delicacy in the clothing and the light. So these kinds of paintings, although they weren't as dramatic as Caravaggio's biblical stuff, they were very popular. People loved this. Kind of like almost like dark comedies. To go with all of the high-minded stuff. Okay, so that's Caravaggio. He's totally fabulous. He dies young. He dies poor. He's quickly forgotten, and then you know, the 20th century he comes back. I also want to show you Georges de la Tour, who lives about the same time. He sort of follows Caravaggio. He's not the same kind of genius, but the stuff is so much fun. Look at this. It's sort of following on the idea of the card sharps. Here's de la Tour's version of the fortune teller, right? You have the old gypsy woman on the right who is receiving a coin from the foppish young man in the middle to tell his fortune. But notice that the people around him are all sort of working together to steal from him, right? His purse is being taken. The medallion is being cut off, while the gypsy distracts him with all manner of nonsense. He's going to lose he's going to lose all this. Similarly, this one is called The Cheater with the Ace of Diamonds, and again we have a sort of a conspiracy to rip off an unsophisticated and vapid young noble. The guy on the right with the super fancy clothes is playing cards. The woman in the center is conspiring with the man on the left to distract him. Her servant is there getting the kid drunk. The woman is, shall we say, displaying her assets to keep the boy occupied, while the guy on the left is pulling out the ace of diamonds from his belt to slide into his hand and to steal from the poor young man, who will leave poorer, but perhaps one hopes a little bit wiser. Okay, so much for Caravaggio, who we lingered over because he's so fabulous, and because he really is one of the godfathers of Baroque art. But remember that Baroque is very often about power, and so some of the most important Baroque painters are court painters, by which we mean they were employed by the courts of different kings, and that they were paid for their talent to make particular messages that kings wanted to send. And the most important of them are guys like Velazquez, who is the great painter of Spain, Rubens, who paints for the French court, and Van Dyck, who is the English court painter. So we begin with Velazquez. Velazquez, who basically lives during the 17th century. He was the leading artist of King Philip IV of Spain, one of the most important Spanish painters ever, and he is sort of the great Baroque portrait artist, and is sort of universally revered for his technique and his subtlety. This is a self-portrait of Velazquez, and there's a certain honesty, perhaps, as he stares into his own eyes and gives us this rendering of himself. Here is Philip IV of Spain. You can see, of course, the famous Habsburg jaw. Velazquez was a great favorite of Philip, both for his talent and for his personality. Philip was not a joyful man. He had all sorts of difficulties in his life, but he liked Velazquez, and they spent a great deal of time together. And here you can see Velazquez, having made a Baroque portrait. It is, on the one hand, although static, it is there is drama here, there is light, there is dark, there is shadow, and it portrays the monarch as strong, erect, and quite imposing. As Philip grew older, Velazquez painted him many times, and in fact, Velazquez's eye was so discerning, and his portraits were so revealing that as he got older, Philip was less and less willing to have Velazquez paint him. He didn't like the way he looked as he got older and older. And I suppose it says something about Philip that he did not insist that Velazquez fictionalize him. He could have said, well, you must paint me, but you must make me look younger and stronger. He didn't do that, but he didn't let him paint him as an old, weakened man either. The most famous painting by Velazquez, and one of the most famous paintings in all the world, is this, Las Meninas, which is Spanish for the Maids of Honor. This is on the short list for the most famous paintings in history. You know, you've got the Mona Lisa, you've got the Night Watch, you've got Michelangelo, perhaps. The Las Meninas is another one of these paintings which is universally revered. It's complex, it's enigmatic, it raises questions about reality and illusion and this sort of uncertain relationship between the viewer and the people who are being depicted. It's a painting that people have analyzed endlessly. You know, you can make your entire career out of trying to figure out what's going on this. At its most basic, this is a painting in the royal palace in Madrid during the reign of King Philip IV, and there are several people from the Spanish court who are present here, and there's this sort of particular moment, right? It's like a snapshot of what's going on. Some of these figures are looking straight out at the canvas, at the viewer. The little blonde girl in the center is the Infanta, the princess, Margaret Teresa, who is the daughter of the King of Philip. She's surrounded by her maids of honor, by her chaperone, her bodyguard. Those are the two adults in the sort of mid-background there. There are two dwarves on the right foreground. The dwarves were constant presence in courts as entertainers, as relief, as kinds of truth tellers. There's a dog. On the left is Velazquez himself, the man, in the black holding the painting is a self-portrait of Velazquez, and that large canvas which is back to us is probably the painting itself. So we are looking at the back of the painting that we are looking at, or something. There's a mirror in the center background, and in that you can see the reflection of the king and the queen. So if the king and the queen are being reflected in the mirror, they are ahead of the painting, essentially where you, the viewer, are. So you are being put in the place of the king and the queen. Is that what's happening? This is you can read endlessly about this, about the composition, about why Velazquez and Margaret Teresa are looking straight at us, why the others are not, who the mysterious man in the background, the right, going through the doorway is, whether he's entering or leaving. There was a great quote. Someone described this as the theology of painting, the true philosophy of art. Velazquez's supreme achievement, super self-conscious, very calculated, a very interesting, complex set of images. And again, Baroque, right? It's all about power. It's about royalty, and the light and the dark and the shadow and the drama of it. It really is quite magnificent. So moving north to Rubens. Rubens is a Dutchman who made his reputation painting in France mostly during the beginnings of the 17th century. So during the era of Louis XIII, before Louis XIII's reign, during Louis XIII's reign, Richelieu, that's the time when Rubens is making his mark. And he is most famously associated with Marie de Medici. Marie is the second wife of Henry IV, Henry of Navarre. Remember, Paris is worth a mass. The Catholic princess that he married that brought on the whole massacre of St. Bartholomew. She dies, and he marries this Italian princess named Marie, who then becomes the Queen of France. Then when Henry is assassinated, you remember Henry is assassinated by a Catholic fanatic because of Parisian traffic. Louis XIII is still a young boy, and so Marie becomes the regent, effectively the ruler of France. She enjoyed being the ruler of France, and in fact sort of kept her son under her thumb for as long as she could, and finally he got sick of it and exiled her and locked her up and stuff. Rubens, as a talented young painter, comes to Marie's notice and becomes a great favorite of hers and paints several very important works. This is a portrait of Marie herself, looking rich and powerful and perhaps somewhat self-satisfied. His most famous works, perhaps, are the Marie cycle. He painted a series of enormous paintings, which are in the Louvre now, depicting the life of Marie and sort of celebrating it. This is one of the earlier ones. This is the entry of Henry IV into Paris. Remember, Henry has won the French Wars of Religion. He's in a position to take over Paris, but he converts rather than conquering the place. And this depicts that moment in a highly fanciful, allegorical way. So like him entering to great cheers and blessings, unifying France. This is Marie arriving at Marseilles. She has been sent from Italy to meet her husband, Henry. They have not met before. They were married in absentia. And so here is the young Marie, Rubens doing his best to make her look beautiful and being brought forward. And again, there's, mythological figures flying over her and great blessings, and the goddesses and the nymphs of the water are rising up to carry her into her new home of France, and it's all very, very impressive. You probably have already noticed the fleshy, naked butt scenes. Rubens was a great fan of women, a great fan of skin and flesh. You may occasionally hear someone described as Rubenesque, which is usually means someone quite voluptuous. Rubens liked curves, and Rubenesque, and the style and the fashion was very, very curvaceous. So these kind of things are they're cyclical, right? Now there's sort of the 21st century. We have our female archetypes are skinny people like Taylor Swift, but that's just fashion, that's style. It ebbs and flows. Taylor Swift would have been considered
really, really unattractive and out of favor in the 17th century, whereas someone like Nicki Minaj. Now, Nicki Minaj has a Rubenesque figure. So here's a later picture in the cycle. This is the apotheosis of Henry IV and the proclamation of the Regency of Marie de Medici of May 14th, 1610. And not the most harmonious title perhaps ever. But again, this is this is that thing about the Baroque focus on power. Here you see circled, this is Henry at the moment of his death, right? Again, caught in Parisian traffic, stabbed to death in his carriage. But look, he's being lifted up to heaven by the powers. And here on the right, poor Marie, bereft because of the death of her husband, but bravely taking on the rulership of France. Look at the people and the powers and the gods begging her, please, please, Mother Marie, rule us, care for us. And sadly, reluctantly, she agrees to take on the great weight, even though she's devastated by the horrible death of her husband. Yeah. Okay, going across the channel to Anthony Van Dyck. Van Dyck is he's Flemish, but he becomes the great court painter in England, and is most famous for his portraits of Charles I and his family. And Van Dyck, if Rubens has this kind of fawning, sycophantic, royalty and this great allegorical sense of power, Van Dyck is much more relaxed. There's a very English relaxed elegance to it, and he's so successful that all English portraits pretty much look like Van Dyck for the next 150 years. He's meticulous. He's a great draftsman. And he's living about the same time as Rubens. So just to remind you what the relationship between England and France are at this period. You remember the sequence, right? James I gives birth to Charles I. Henry IV, as you saw, marries Marie de Medici. So Louis XIII is growing up and is king of France. He has a sister named Henrietta. Henrietta marries Charles I. So she is the French princess who becomes an English queen, and Charles and Henrietta then have the two future kings of England, Charles II and James II. Meanwhile, Louis XIII marries Anne of Austria, and they have Louis XIV, maybe. And you remember also that during after the English Civil War and during the Commonwealth of Cromwell, the children Charles, or in this case young men Charles and James, flee across the Channel, and they stay in France at Versailles with their cousin Louis XIV, who protects them and takes care of them during Cromwell's reign. And then, of course, they come back and they will become the monarchs of the Restoration. So here is Van Dyck, English Baroque, right? Charles I of England and Henrietta, his French princess wife. And interestingly, they had what is by most accounts seems to have been actually a really nice marriage. They seem to have been very fond of each other. Charles was sort of gossip about is that he let his wife push him around and didn't dominate her, which the way he should have, which by our standards basically means that he was nice to her and treated her well and had a marriage that we might aspire to. So here they are. Again, you see sort of the Baroque stylings, but with an English understatement. Here's another one, Charles on horseback. Again, if this was a painting of Louis XIV, you would expect to see, much more drama, much more power, much more overt, in your face, I am the king. Charles is clearly monarch, but he's a little more he's a little more relaxed about it. I love this one. This is Charles I at the hunt. I mean, look at him. Look at he's got this kind of casual swag. Charles, by the way, loved art. He was the great patron of arts of the English monarch. He loved the idea of using art to promote his view of monarchy and absolute monarchy. And so when he would commission portraits like this, it was very intentional. Again, that Baroque emphasis. We are intentionally demonstrating our power. So he's the one who brings Van Dyck over. He's the one who patronizes Van Dyck. He's the one who gets Van Dyck to portray him with this sort of easy, here I am. I just happen to be casually out here standing amongst nature. And he's just a natural aristocrat. Relaxed elegance, understated authority. A small problem, by the way, because the king was less than 5 feet tall. He's a tiny guy. And it's hard to make a little guy look that impressive. But notice how Van Dyck does it. Moves him in the foreground, lights him, has the horse bowing down next to him. He's this totally natural look, instinctive sovereignty. It's deliberately informal as he sort of negligently, casually strolls about, king, but also just naturally boss. So that was sort of Charles's self-image, and that's how Van Dyck helped him look. So we move now to the Netherlands, where some of the most famous of the Baroque images are found. Just a reminder, the Netherlands won their freedom from Spain during the first part of the 17th century. Unlike in places like Spain and France and England, the art is sort of a mass market art. There are no court or there's no court to be patronizing and controlling art. And the churches, Protestant churches, were quite plain. They didn't have the sort of super fancy stuff that dominated in Catholic churches in the Mediterranean world, for example. So where's the art coming from? Well, ordinary people, or at least bourgeois people who have some money, are buying paintings in a way that would not have up till now. Regular people are decorating their homes with paintings, and the society was defined by its art. By the notions of plenty and by the genre paintings. So Dutch painting, Dutch Baroque, is characterized by its simplicity, by the sort of the genre, the settings, the common settings that we'll see. We don't see grand kings, we see regular people doing regular things. We see group portraits where power is depicted. It's usually not one guy, it's groups of people. Because you remember that in the Netherlands, corporate bodies held the power, not individual aristocrats. And the painters of this period are some of the real superstars. Vermeer and Rembrandt, these guys were just, were sort of incalculable and geniuses. So we begin with Jan Vermeer. Vermeer specialized in these domestic scenes of middle-class life. In his own lifetime, he was sort of moderately successful. He made a living, but he was certainly not rich, and he was certainly not thought of as very famous. Part of the problem was he didn't paint a lot. He worked very, very slowly. He took great care using very bright colors, sometimes very expensive colors, and that made his cost of production very high. It meant that when he sold stuff, his margins were smaller, and so that prevents him from becoming rich. He mostly paints domestic interiors, set in one or two small rooms in his little house
with the same furniture and the same decorations that he would move around. And when he dies, he becomes really quite obscure, and nobody really talks about him until about the 19th century, when he's sort of rediscovered and becomes very famous. And now that we make movies about Vermeer and his paintings, he's sort of he's really quite famous. Notice that he's sort of picking up after the Baroque court painters that we looked up. He's more mid 17th century. So we start with the Milkmaid. Really quite a beautiful painting. I mean, notice the color, notice the light. In one hand, it's a very simple thing, right? It's a kitchen maid, it's a housemaid. She's a regular servant pouring milk. She's probably making bread pudding. You can see from the torn up bread in front of her being combined with milk. There's notice how it conveys sort of weight. It isn't just light, but there's a presence to these things. There's a rough texture. I mean, the bread looks like bread. The woman looks like a woman. She's got a thick waist. She's got round shoulders. She's a working person, and yet you look at that face. It's like a Mona Lisa thing. You can spend a lot of time looking at her face and say, what is she thinking about? Is she smiling? Is she amused by something? Is she thinking about something happy or perhaps sort of intriguing, or perhaps maybe she's just concentrating. She's concentrating very hard on her work, getting it just right. There's a sort of a nobility of common things here that's very appealing. Here's the geographer. This is part of sort of the scientific revolution part, right? You notice the trappings of geography around this man, a learned man, a scholar, who is peering off and sort of seeing the world as it is. Again, the light, the dark, the shadows. Even though there's a simple, quiet moment, there's an intensity to this. The flip side of this, the astronomer, right? The man who looks into the heavens, and he also, in a very, very similar room, has the tools and the light and the sense of it all. They're quite wonderful. But of course, the painting of Vermeer's, which is most famous, which you have all probably heard of, is this. This is the girl with the pearl earring. Using that earring as the focal point of the image. It's not a formal portrait. He probably didn't sit down and say, I'm going to paint a portrait of this young woman. Rather, he used the young woman as the structure for this particular depiction of light and shadow, and the way it falls upon her face. And again, that wonderful Baroque color, and the drama of the light and the dark, and the way he catches just look at the pearl. Look at how, that's what a pearl looks like, and yet he does it in paint, and it's really, it's just an extraordinary image. There have been many different popular riffs on this. They made a movie called The Girl with the Pearl Earring a few years ago, which you've probably heard of and maybe even seen, starring Scarlett Johansson as the girl with the pearl earring. And I think that actually the painting is better looking than Scarlett Johansson. Now, if you can make a painting that looks better than Scarlett Johansson, you've really accomplished something. Of course, your individual opinions may vary. Okay, the other great Dutch superstar, the one everyone has heard of, is Rembrandt. Rembrandt was considered the great painter during his lifetime. Unlike some of these other guys, he was hugely successful at the time, and he's painting
sort of the same time as Vermeer, mid to then later part of the 17th century. And we think of him as Baroque, but Rembrandt really almost goes beyond Baroque. Many of his works are a little more subtle, perhaps, than your classic Baroque, and he sort of gives rise to these new ideas, new genres in painting. He was very successful young. He made a lot of money, but then he had hardships with personal losses, financial hardships, and you can sort of see this as you move through his art. But ultimately, I think maybe the best thing about Rembrandt is there's this empathy to him. There's this sense of really understanding and sympathizing with his subjects, even while he looks at them very clear-eyed, even when he's looking at himself. There's a great line that Rembrandt is one of the great prophets of civilization, a person who really truly believes that people are equal and have a shared identity, a shared humanity. So here's one that you've no doubt seen, or at least caricatures of it. This is called the Syndics of the Drapers Guild. These are sort of the guys in charge of the drapers or the cloth guild, whose job it was to assess the quality of cloth. If you were selling cloth as part of the guild, you had to have it approved that it was of a certain quality, and that when it was approved, then you knew that you weren't getting ripped off. You knew you were getting what you paid for. It was a sort of self-regulation as part of the market, each of these guys would have a separate set of steel pliers. They would press the seal of their city into these plugs of lead, which were then affixed the results of the inspection, and so there were 4 grades, and if you got all 4 guys to seal this, that was indicated the highest quality of cloth. So in a sense, this is mundane, right? These are guys who measure cloth, right? I mean, wow, big deal. And yet you look at them and you look at how they're depicted and how they're individualized, and even though their clothes are sort of severe, they're also rich. These are not poor men. These are men of some consequence, and depicted individually and with, I would say, great refinement. And then there's this. This is known as The Night Watch. Again, one of the paintings on the short list for most famous, most respected paintings in all of Western art. The actual proper title is The Company of Captus Franz Banning Koch and Lieutenant Wilhelm von Reichenbach. They are preparing to march out. Everyone now just calls it The Night Watch. It's renowned for many things. It's like Las Meninas. It's been endlessly studied and commented upon. But if you're going to summarize it, there's really 3 things about it. First, it's enormous size. It's a giant painting. It's like 12 feet by 14 feet. It's just a huge work. It makes marvelous use of light and shadow, that chiaroscuro contrast between light and dark again, and this sense of motion. Things are moving, right? This is not a static military portrait. There's things happening here. Baroque movement, light, drama. It's done in 1642. This is the peak of the Dutch Golden Age. The company is moving out to do something, to patrol, to fight. And the captain
who is dressed in black with the red sash. There's his lieutenant, William, who's dressed in yellow with the white sash there in the foreground. And you know, through the use of the light, he draws your eyes towards the three most important figures, those two, and the small girl in the left. You know, there's so much going on here. The girl in the yellow dress sort of is a sort of a mascot of the unit. The different things she's carrying, like the claws of the dead chicken in her belt, represent the rifleman, the arquebusiers. The pistol behind her, she's holding the malicious goblet. There's all sorts of symbolism here, but you know, there's other things going on, other layers of meaning. You know, there's a symmetrical division between these guys. You know, between the people on the left and on the right, and it's representing the union between the Dutch Protestants and the Dutch Catholics to evoke the war effort against the Spanish, all Dutch together against the Spanish. The taller captain in black symbolizes the Dutch Protestant leadership. The slightly smaller but forceful guy in yellow is the loyal support of the Dutch Catholics. And so, you know, all of these painted characters, if you dive into them, have double meanings. And again, it's just a painting that you could spend a great deal of time poking around at and puzzling over. Rembrandt also was famous for self-portraits. He painted himself astutely over the course of his life. Here he is in 1640, young man on the make, right? This is a guy, this dude has got it going on, right? I mean, this is a person who people have told him he's a genius and how much money he's made and how much great art he's done, and he's fabulous, and he knows that he's fabulous, and he's confident, and he paints himself that way, and boy, you just know this is not going to last. Here's Rembrandt in 1660, right? A couple decades later, and you can see he's gotten older, right? You can see it hasn't gone quite as easily as maybe he thought. You can see that he's carrying some weight there. But the eyes, right? The eyes. And then 9 years later, in 1669, we get this. We get Rembrandt as an old man with his hands clenched, and boy, you know, his whole life. Imagine being able to look at yourself that clearly and that honestly. It's quite remarkable. All right, so that is the Baroque. We'll move next into the Rococo.